Welcome back. Okay, now that we've got our data shaped into the format we wanted to, let's write that into an output file. In order to do that, you've got a transformation which is called a sync transformation. So let's search for that. And I'm going to call this one as cases and death sync. Okay, so incoming string is the select we got there and the sync type. Again, similar to the source, you can choose a data set or you can have an inline data set here. But inline data set, as we said before, there is limited support for that one. So at the moment the supported sync types or blob store, data lake storage Gen 1 and Gen 2, Synapse Analytics, SQL Database, Cosmos DB, and Snowflakes. You can check this drop down to know the supported type. And you've got the dataset support and the inline dataset support here. For the purposes of this exercise, let's assume that we are going to output our data into a CSV, a delimited text file within Data Lake Storage Gen 2. As you can see from here, that has to be within ADF dataset as opposed to an inline dataset. So we need to create an ADF dataset within our data factory. But before we do that, let's create a container within our Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account so that we can reference that within the dataset. So let's do that first. So let's come over here to our Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and click on the Create Blob container and call it Processed. And now switch over to the Data Factory. And let's click Create from here and select ADLS Gen 2. Click Continue, Delimited Text File. Click Continue again. And I'm going to call this as DS Processed Cases and Deaths. And let's pick the link services from here. And let's pick the file path. So we just created the process container there. Now we need to give the directory under which we want to write the data to. So I'm going to call this as ECDC/cases_deaths. As you can see, I haven't specified a file. I've given a folder for the cases and deaths data to be written. That's mainly because Spark runs on a distributed computing architecture. So it'll be partitioning all the data as it processes, and it'll write all the data into that folder. There might be more than one file in there, so we'll have a look at it in a bit. And we want to have a header for our file. So let's put header there. And we don't have a schema, so let's say none for that one. And we are going to click OK for that. And here you can specify the number of lines to skip from the string before writing to the output, which is a sync. And you can also specify whether you want to allow for schema drift. So if you had a new column coming in your source and you want that to flow through, then you would say actually it's allow schema drift. And you can validate the schema if you had one. In our case, actually our dataset doesn't have a schema specified, but if you had one you can tick this and it'll validate the schema, and if there are any issues, it will fail as well. And in settings, you can create the folder. As we said before, we've got a folder into which actually Spark's going to write the data. And you can create the folder up front and then it'll write the files. Otherwise, it'll just add to the folder. And you can specify the name options. You can go with the default options, or you can specify if pattern or partition, you can specify your name. And you can also have your file names based on your data in the columns. So for example, you could create one file per country in this case. Or you can write all the data to one single file. And you can specify the file name here. One thing to bear in mind is when you write all of your data into one file, it's going to single stream. So it is going to be very slow in processing the data. And if you want to call all your data, you can click that as well. So I'm going to put it back into default, and then we'll play with these options and see how our data looks like. And also, I'm going to clear the folder so we can rerun this pipeline a couple of times to see what happens. And mappings, this is very similar to the select transformation. We have got our select transformation to prepare our data. If we didn't do that, then we can do all the mappings here as well. But I quite like to do it in a select transformation so I can see the data before putting it into sync. So optimize, it's very similar to the other ones. You can specify a single partition, or you can set your own partitioning strategy. Let's have a look at the inspect metadata for the file. It is exactly the same. Nothing's been changed. So we are going to have our country code, 2-digit, 3-digit, and then population, case count, death count, reported date, and source. And now let's click on the refresh to see the data. Okay, so we got all our data. So that's all working fine. You can, now that you've added a sync, this transformation will be valid if I click validate it is valid. So I can publish to Data Factory. So publishing is now completed. All our changes are back in the Data Factory. In the next lesson, we'll create a pipeline which will invoke this data flow and process all of the data through. What you've seen so far is just looking at the data preview. The preview doesn't really write any data to the sync. It needs to be executed from a pipeline in order to write all the data into a sync. So that's what we'll do in the next lesson. I'll see you then.